A woman, an orphan, born in the shadows, carries the weight of a nation in her hands. Born of pain, raised in silence. She doesn't know it yet, but destiny, like an invisible thread, already calls to her. But to change destiny, courage is required. The courage to face the empire itself and what lurks in the shadows. She is not just a young woman chosen by chance. She is the key to something greater. When destinies collide, what remains? Power or compassion? Vengeance or redemption? Destiny chose her, but she chose to be more than a queen. She chose to be the salvation of her people. In a world of immutable laws, she risks her life to save those she loves. In the days when the sun rose over 127 provinces, when the Persian Empire extended its dominions from the frozen lands of India to the burning deserts of Ethiopia, Ahasuerus reigned over the greatest expanse of land that human eyes had ever beheld. It was an era of gold and purple, of palaces that touched the clouds and riches that made the gods themselves envious. Susa, the winter capital, rose like a jewel set in the heart of the known world, its white marble walls reflecting the light of dawn like celestial mirrors. In those times, when a king's word could move armies across continents and his sealed decree was more immutable than the mountains themselves, the ivory and gold throne of great Ahasuerus had remained empty beside him. Queen Vashti, once mistress of the hanging gardens and perfumed harems, had vanished from history like smoke carried by the desert wind, banished for her refusal to display her beauty before the intoxicated nobles. The king, in his solitary majesty, needed a new consort who could share the heaviest crown in the world. It was then that the wise counselors, men whose white beards guarded the secrets of decades, approached the throne with a proposal that would echo through the centuries. "Let emissaries be sent to the four corners of the empire," they proclaimed, "so that every maiden of incomparable beauty might be brought to the royal presence. Let beauty contests be established in every province, every satrapy, every walled city, and every forgotten village. The entire empire would be searched for one who could captivate the heart of the man who ruled the world." And so the royal heralds were dispatched, riding along the dusty roads that connected Babylon to Ecbatana, Persepolis to Memphis. Their voices echoed in bustling markets and silent squares, announcing that destiny itself had opened its doors for any young woman whose eyes could rival the stars and whose smile could make the sun seem pale. In one of the humblest streets of Susa, where houses pressed against one another like sheep seeking shelter from the storm, lived a man named Mordecai. He was of the tribe of Benjamin, descendant of those who had been torn from Jerusalem by the Babylonian eagles of war decades before. His hands, calloused by work in the royal records, held memories of a promised land he had never seen, but which he carried in his blood as sacred inheritance. Under Mordecai's modest roof grew a young woman whose name was Hadassah, though she was known by the Persian name of Esther. Orphaned from tender age, when the plague had cut down her parents like a relentless scythe cuts ripe wheat, she had found in her cousin not only a guardian, but a loving father who had raised her as if she were daughter of his own blood. Esther had blossomed like a rose in the most unlikely garden. Her beauty was not of the kind that cries out for attention, but of the silent variety that takes possession of the soul like melody heard in dreams. Her dark eyes contained depths that seemed to reflect distant stars, and her black hair fell over her shoulders like a cascade of nocturnal silk. There was something in her face that transcended mere physical beauty, a serene grace, a natural dignity that made the very birds stop singing when she passed. When the royal officers arrived at that forgotten quarter, Going from house to house like hunters seeking the rarest prey, the experienced eyes of Haggai, the chief eunuch of the royal harem, settled upon Esther and could never turn away. Here was something that his many years of service at court had taught him to recognize: not just beauty, but that indefinable quality that separates queens from all other women. "This one," he murmured to his assistants, "this one carries destiny within her." Mordecai's heart broke like a clay vessel when he understood that the hour of separation had come. But his words to Esther were laden with wisdom that seemed to flow from sources far beyond his mortal experience. "Go, daughter of my heart," he said, his trembling hands touching for the last time the face he had watched grow in beauty and grace. "But remember always, do not reveal your origin or your people. There are times to speak and times to be silent, and this is a time to keep silence until the Eternal reveals his purposes." Thus, Esther was taken to the royal palace, where the perfumed gardens and marble corridors awaited her like a dream from which she would never completely awaken. Along with hundreds of other young women from throughout the empire, she entered the golden world of the royal harem, where each day was preparation for a possibility that could change not only her life, but the course of history itself. In the royal palace, under Haggai's watchful tutelage, Esther captivated hearts even before conquering the king's love. There was something in her genuine humility, in her natural gentleness, that made even the other candidates, her direct rivals, love her instead of envying her. The servants fought for the privilege of attending her, not by order, but from pure delight in her presence. 12 long months passed in preparation, 6 months with oil of myrrh, which perfumed her skin like morning gardens, and 6 months with spices and aromatic ointments that made her shine like a polished jewel. Each day brought new beauty treatments, new lessons in royal etiquette, new teachings about court protocols. But through all these rituals of transformation, Esther remained fundamentally unchanged. The same young woman of humble heart who had walked the dusty streets of Susa. When finally her turn came to be presented to the king, Esther asked for nothing beyond what Haggai had suggested. While other young women adorned themselves with spectacular jewels and garments that cost entire fortunes, she chose simplicity that enhanced her natural beauty instead of competing with it. On that fateful night, when Esther crossed the golden doors of the royal chambers, the very air seemed to hold its breath. King Ahasuerus, accustomed to all the marvels that wealth and power could provide, felt something in his chest that he had long forgotten how to name. Here was beauty, yes, but also something more precious, a soul that shone through the eyes like light through pure crystal. The love that was born that night was not the passing whim of a bored monarch, but the deep passion of a man who had finally found the one who could make complete the most powerful throne on earth. Esther had conquered more than a kingdom. She had conquered a royal heart. When the crown was placed upon her head, amid the splendor of a ceremony that lasted 7 days and 7 nights, when the heralds proclaimed to the 4 winds that a new queen had been born for the empire, Esther kept guarded in her heart the secret that Mordecai had entrusted to her. No one in the palace knew that the new queen of the most powerful empire on earth was a daughter of Israel, a descendant of those who had wept by the rivers of Babylon. Thus began the reign of a queen who would rule not only with the authority of the royal scepter, but with a secret destiny that awaited its hour to manifest. The empire celebrated, ignorant that it had crowned not just a queen, but the future salvation of an entire people. In the quietude of her new royal life, as she walked through the perfumed gardens and contemplated the crystalline waters of the marble fountains, Esther sometimes wondered why destiny had brought her from a humble house in Susa to the highest throne in the world. She did not yet know that the answer to that question would change the course of history, and saved the lives of millions of people she didn't even know. While the royal gardens flourished under the gentle touch of the new queen, and the hearts of subjects filled with admiration for her grace, in the shadows of power, a sinister storm began to form. Like a serpent that crawls silently through the grass before striking the mortal blow, a man of dark ambitions ascended the stairs of imperial power, carrying with him the poison of ancestral hatreds that reached back to generations lost in the dust of time. Haman, son of Hammedatha, descendant of the royal lineage of the Amalekites, had arrived at the court of Susa like many other nobles from distant provinces, with hunger for power and thirst for recognition. But unlike the other courtiers who contented themselves with lesser honors and passing favors, Haman possessed that corrosive ambition that devours the soul like fire devours dry straw. His eyes, cold as winter ice, saw in each step of the royal hierarchy only an intermediate step toward the absolute summit of power. King Ahasuerus, absorbed in his conjugal happiness and confident in the stability of his vast empire, saw in Haman qualities that other men might question. Where more astute observers might have perceived cold calculation, the king saw admirable dedication. Thus, step by step, decree by decree, Haman was elevated in the structures of power until his position became second only to that of the king himself. When finally the royal decree was proclaimed elevating Haman to the post of prime minister of the empire, when his authority was established over all other princes and satraps, when the royal ring itself was placed in his hand as symbol of almost absolute power, it seemed that the gods had crowned human ambition with complete success. Haman had reached heights that made even the sons of kings envious, and his power extended like a gigantic shadow over all the provinces of the empire. With power came arrogance, and with arrogance, the demand for adulation that grew like a malignant tumor. Haman established that all royal servants should prostrate themselves before him whenever he passed, bending the knee and touching face to ground, as if he were divinity incarnate. Most courtiers and officials accepted this demand without question. After all, history had taught that it is safer to bow before power than to challenge it. But at the gates of the royal palace, where scribes and guards maintained constant vigil, where decrees were copied and visitors received, worked a man whose knee would never bend before mortal flesh. Mordecai, the Benjamite scribe, continued his daily functions with the same meticulous dedication he had shown during years of faithful service. The first time Haman perceived this insubordination, he imagined it was mere carelessness or distraction. He ordered his servants to call the stubborn scribe's attention to proper protocols. But when the royal servants approached Mordecai with their courteous but firm instructions, they received an answer that left them perplexed and uneasy. "I am a Jew," declared Mordecai with voice serene but unshakable, "and my knee bends only before the Eternal, Creator of heaven and earth. No mortal, however high his position, will receive from me the worship that belongs to God alone." Those words, repeated by the servants to Haman's ears, fell upon his wounded pride like drops of acid on polished metal. Here was direct challenge to his authority, flagrant insubordination that, if tolerated, could encourage others to follow the same example. But there was something deeper that disturbed Haman, something that touched ancestral fibers of hatred that he didn't even fully understand. When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, something dark awakened in the depths of Haman's soul. Echoes of ancient conflicts, of wars fought by his Amalekite ancestors against the children of Israel, of humiliations suffered and revenge promised but never satisfied. The refusal of a single man to prostrate himself had transformed into symbol of a much broader and more threatening resistance. Haman was not a man of small vengeances or partial solutions. If one Jew dared to challenge him, then all Jews would pay for that insolence. If Mordecai refused to recognize his supreme authority, then Mordecai's own people would be swept from the face of the earth, as a terrible example for all future generations. The seed of genocide began to germinate in Haman's feverish mind, fed by daily anger and wounded pride that transformed into murderous obsession. For months, Haman cultivated his plan with the patience of an experienced hunter preparing a trap for dangerous prey. He studied Jewish customs, mapped their communities scattered throughout the provinces of the empire, calculated how many lives would be cut down when his vengeance finally fell upon them. And in his twisted mind, he began to see not just an opportunity for personal revenge, but a chance to become the architect of the greatest massacre in human history. When he finally felt prepared to act, Haman resorted to the ancient customs of divination that his ancestors had practiced. He ordered that lots be cast, small dice of bone and stone that the Persians called Purim, to determine the most propitious month and day to execute his diabolical plan. As if destiny itself were conspiring with his malignant intentions, the lots indicated the 12th month, the month of Adar. Still distant, almost a full year, Haman smiled with sinister satisfaction as he contemplated this result. A full year to perfect his plans, to convince the king of the necessity of his action, to prepare the entire empire for the day when every Jew, man, woman, and child would be exterminated from the face of the earth. A year to savor in advance the revenge that would wash away once and for all the humiliation of seeing a single man remain standing in his presence. Thus, while Queen Esther lived her golden days in the perfumed gardens of the palace, completely ignoring the danger approaching like a storm on the horizon, and while Mordecai continued his functions at the royal gates, without suspecting that his refusal to prostrate himself had sealed the fate of his entire people, Haman plotted in the shadows of power the final solution that he believed would rid the world of the troublesome presence of the children of Israel. The enemy had emerged, and his fury would know no limits until it was sated with the blood of an entire nation. Like an eagle that plans its flight before diving upon its prey, Haman calculated every word, every gesture, every inflection of voice he would use to convince the king of the necessity of his genocidal proposal. The chosen moment was a golden spring morning when King Ahasuerus was in his private chambers, relaxed after a nocturnal banquet and receptive to matters of state that his counselors might bring to his attention. Haman approached the throne with the calculated reverence he had perfected over the years, but in his eyes burned the fanatic flame of those who believe they are executing a sacred mission. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried tones of patriotic concern and zeal for the empire's security that would have convinced even more skeptical observers. "Majesty," he began, his words flowing like poisoned honey, "there exists scattered throughout all the provinces of your kingdom a people whose presence represents constant threat to the empire's stability. They are different from all other peoples. They isolate themselves in their strange traditions. They refuse to integrate into imperial culture. And, what is most serious, they openly despise royal laws whenever these conflict with their barbarous customs." King Ahasuerus, whose mind was more concerned with questions of Palatine architecture and seasonal festivals than with subtleties of ethnic politics, listened with only moderate attention. Haman, perceiving this distraction, intensified the tone of urgency in his voice. "This people," he continued, "represents a nation within the nation, a parallel authority that undermines your supreme authority. To tolerate them is to allow treason to flourish in the very heart of the empire. For the security of your kingdom and the peace of your loyal subjects, it would be advisable to exterminate them completely." To make his proposal more attractive, Haman added an element he knew would appeal directly to the monarch's practical interests. "If it pleases the king, I myself will take charge of all aspects of this operation and will deposit 10,000 talents of silver in the royal treasuries to compensate for any loss of revenue that might result." 10,000 talents of silver. a fortune that could finance entire armies or build new cities. The king, impressed both by the generosity and the apparent dedication of his prime minister, and trusting completely in the judgment of the man he had elevated to such a position of power, removed his signet ring and handed it to Haman without further questions. "Do with that people what seems right to you," said Ahasuerus, with the fatal negligence of those who delegate decisions of life and death without fully understanding their implications. With the royal ring in his hands, Haman now possessed authority to issue decrees that would have force of law throughout the empire. His first action was to summon the royal scribes and dictate the document that would seal the fate of millions of innocent people. The decree was drafted in multiple languages and scripts, so that no corner of the empire could claim ignorance when the day of execution arrived. The edict was of terrible simplicity. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, all Jews dwelling in the provinces of the empire, men, women, elderly, and children, should be killed, destroyed, and exterminated. Their goods would be confiscated by the executors, creating additional incentive for the local population to participate enthusiastically in the massacre. When the royal couriers departed from Susa carrying sealed copies of the mortal decree, they spread throughout the empire's roads like messengers of the apocalypse. Within weeks, the news reached every province, every city, every village where Jews had established their homes and created their families over generations of exile. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Entire communities plunged into deep mourning, as if death had already arrived before the appointed time. Men tore their garments and covered their heads with ashes. Women wept tears that seemed to spring from the very depths of the earth, and small children felt terror without understanding its source. In Susa, Mordecai received news of the decree like a direct stab to the heart. He immediately understood that his refusal to prostrate himself before Haman had unleashed this catastrophe, that his fidelity to principles had condemned his entire people to extinction. The guilt that fell upon him was almost unbearable, but was soon surpassed by an iron determination to find some way to reverse the disaster. Mordecai stripped off his normal garments and covered himself with rough sackcloth, scattered ashes upon his head, and went out into the streets of Susa, crying with a voice that cut the air like a sharp blade. His walk led him to the very gates of the royal palace, where he remained in mourning vigil, because no one dressed in sackcloth could enter the royal precincts. Inside the palace, isolated in her golden queen's life, Esther remained completely ignorant of the tragedy unfolding. Her maidens and eunuchs had created around her a bubble of palatine tranquility, where concerns of the outside world rarely penetrated. But when news came that Mordecai was at the palace gates dressed in sackcloth and covered with ashes, crying like a man possessed by deep desperation, the queen felt a sudden cold pierce her heart. Esther sent decent garments for Mordecai to change and enter the palace, but he refused categorically. His refusal filled her with growing unease, because she knew her cousin too well to believe he would adopt such dramatic behavior without extremely grave reason. Finally, she sent Hatak, one of her most trusted eunuchs, to discover what had caused such transformation in the man who had been her adoptive father. When Hatak returned, he brought with him a copy of the mortal decree and a message from Mordecai that would forever change the course of the queen's life. The words were direct and urgent. "Go to the king and plead with him for mercy for your people." The revelation struck Esther like lightning in a clear sky. Not only did she discover that her people were condemned to extermination, but also that Mordecai expected from her an action that could cost her own life. Approaching the king without being summoned was a crime punishable by death, and even her status as queen did not completely protect her from this inflexible law. With trembling hands, Esther sent back to Hatak a response that revealed both her understanding of the danger and her initial reluctance to assume it. All the king's servants and the people of the provinces know that any person, man or woman, who enters the inner court to approach the king without being summoned, has but one law: death. The only exception is if the king extends the golden scepter, allowing the person to live. And it has been 30 days since I was summoned to go to the king. Mordecai's response came like thunder that awakens those who sleep in false security. His words carried the weight of prophecy and urgency of one who sees catastrophe approaching like an unstoppable avalanche. Do not think that because you are in the royal palace, you will escape any more than all the other Jews. If you remain silent now, relief and deliverance will come for the Jews from another source, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to royal position for such a time as this? Those last words echoed in Esther's mind with force that shook the very foundations of her understanding of her life and destiny. For such a time as this, as if her entire journey from Mordecai's humble house to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth had been orchestrated by an invisible hand, with specific purpose that was only now being revealed. For the first time since she had become queen, Esther understood that her beauty, her position, her access to the king's heart, everything had been preparation for this crucial moment. She was not queen by chance or luck. She was queen because her people needed someone in the exact position she occupied, at this exact moment in history. The decision she made then revealed the transformation of a protected young woman into a woman of extraordinary courage. She sent back to Mordecai a message that would seal her own destiny. Go, gather all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, neither day nor night. I and my maidens will also fast. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. 3 days of fasting were proclaimed among the Jews of Susa, 3 days in which the most powerful queen in the world prepared to possibly die in the attempt to save her people. 3 days in which the destiny of an entire nation depended on the courage of a woman willing to trade her security for the possibility of salvation for millions of innocent lives. The queen who emerged from those 3 days of fasting was no longer the same person who had entered them. She was a woman transformed by encounter with her own destiny, a leader born from understanding that true greatness arises not from seeking personal power, but from willingness to sacrifice everything for those who depend on our courage. As her maidens prepared her for what might be her last day as a living queen, Esther contemplated her image in the polished bronze mirror and saw reflected a figure that seemed to emerge from ancient legend. The beauty was there, more radiant than ever, but tempered now with something much deeper, the majesty of one who understood there are things more precious than life itself, and the serene grace of those who have made peace with the possibility of dying for a just cause. The fast had been more than preparation. It had been transformation. The insecure orphan had become a brave queen. The protected young woman had become savior of her people. The woman who had kept secrets for so long was ready to reveal the truth that might cost her life but save millions of others. For such a time as this, she murmured to her own image. And in the words was complete acceptance of her destiny, total embrace of the responsibility that had been placed upon her shoulders, absolute surrender to the calling that had echoed through the centuries to find her at this precise moment in history. The call of destiny had sounded during 3 days of fasting and preparation, and she would respond with courage that would become legend, with wisdom that would save a nation, with love that would transcend even the fear of death. At dawn of the 3rd day, when the first golden lights of the sun began to paint the palace marbles with tones of honey and amber, Esther awoke from her fast vigil transformed. The face that contemplated the polished bronze mirror was no longer the same that had wept tears of desperation 3 days before. Where once dwelt the uncertainty of a young woman confronted with impossible choices, now shone the serene determination of a woman who had found her strength in the depths of sacrifice. Her maidens, who had fasted with her in silent solidarity, moved around their mistress with almost religious reverence. They perceived that something fundamental had changed in the one they served. A new dignity, a spiritual authority that transcended even royal majesty. It was as if the fast had burned away everything that was merely human in Esther, leaving only what was essential and eternal. The preparation for what might be her last day as a living queen was carried out with meticulous care that bordered on sacred ritual. Each piece of clothing was chosen not only for its beauty, but for its symbolic meaning. Esther opted for her most splendid royal garments, a mantle of royal purple embroidered with gold threads that captured and reflected light like a cascade of liquid stars over a white silk tunic that shone with angelic purity. Her hair was arranged in a style that revealed the beauty of her face without unnecessary ostentation, allowing her eyes, now shining with inner light that the fast had kindled, to be the main focus of her appearance. The jewels chosen were few but significant. A pearl necklace that Ahasuerus had given as a wedding gift, gold earrings that reflected light like small suns, and upon her head, the royal crown that symbolized both her authority and her responsibility. When she finally contemplated herself in the mirror, Esther saw reflected a figure that seemed to emerge from ancient legend. The beauty was there, more radiant than ever, but tempered now with something much deeper. The majesty of one who understood there are things more precious than life itself, and the serene grace of those who have made peace with the possibility of dying for a just cause. The path through the palace corridors toward the inner court had never seemed so long. Each step echoed against the polished marbles like heartbeat, counting the final moments before an irreversible decision. The gigantic columns that supported the vaulted ceilings seemed like silent witnesses to a drama that could change the course of history. And the perfumed gardens she passed through whispered like voices of future generations whose destiny depended on the courage of a single woman. When she finally reached the golden doors that separated the king's private chambers from the rest of the palace, Esther paused to breathe deeply and murmur a silent prayer. Beyond those doors was the man she loved, but also the monarch whose mood and disposition would determine whether she would live to see another sunset. The law was clear and inflexible. Death for whoever approached the king without being summoned, unless the golden scepter was extended in forgiveness. With movement that combined royal gracefulness with unshakable determination, Esther pushed the golden doors and crossed the forbidden threshold. Each step echoed through the hall like heartbeat, counting the last moments before eternity. The vast space seemed to expand infinitely before her, the marble pillars rising like silent witnesses to a drama that could end in triumph or tragedy. The sound of her sandals against the polished marble created hypnotic rhythm that seemed to echo not only in the present, but through time. Each step marking the destiny of millions of lives that depended on this forbidden approach. The guards posted at the entrances remained paralyzed between duty to protect royal protocol and shock at seeing the queen herself violating the most fundamental law of the court. King Ahasuerus was reclining on his ivory and gold throne, a majestic figure absorbed in reading scrolls that scribes had brought for his morning consideration. Light filtered through the high windows created a golden halo around his figure, making him appear almost divine in his absolute authority. When the sound of unauthorized entry penetrated his concentration, he raised his eyes with slow and deliberate movement. What followed was a moment of temporal suspension that seemed to last centuries. The king's eyes met the queen's across the space that separated them, and in that meeting of gazes, an epic battle was fought between fundamental forces of the universe. Law against love, tradition against mercy, inflexible justice against human compassion. Esther remained motionless like a marble statue near the entrance, but her immobility radiated tension that made the very air vibrate with electricity. Every line of her body revealed both respectful submission and dignity that refused to be broken even before the possibility of death. She spoke no word, extended no hand in supplication, did not prostrate herself in gesture of desperation. She simply remained there, allowing her radiant presence to speak a language that transcended words. The seconds stretched like eternities, while destiny balanced on a tightrope between salvation and destruction. Ahasuerus contemplated his queen's figure with eyes that registered every detail, the pallor in her faces that revealed the emotional cost of her decision, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed the fear she fought to control, but also the inner light that shone through her eyes like flame that no storm can extinguish. Here was the woman who had conquered his heart, but now revealed dimensions of character he had never suspected. The courage to risk everything for a cause greater than her own security. The inner strength that sustained her even when facing certain death. The serene dignity that transformed transgression of law into act of sublime heroism. Slowly, as if each centimeter of movement cost Herculean effort, as if he were moving mountains with the force of his will, King Ahasuerus raised the golden scepter toward Esther. The precious metal shone in the morning light like sunbeam breaking through stormy clouds, tangible symbol that mercy had triumphed over legal inflexibility. The gesture was accompanied by collective sigh that echoed through the hall like wind bringing relief after suffocating storm. All present, guards, scribes, courtiers, had held their breath during those tense moments, unconsciously participating in the drama unfolding before their eyes. The law had been fulfilled through mercy, tradition had been honored through compassion, and Esther was free to approach the throne that might have become her scaffold. With measured steps that revealed both relief and gratitude, Esther walked through the hall until she came close enough to touch the tip of the golden scepter with fingers that trembled slightly. It was symbolic gesture of accepting royal pardon, but also moment of silent intimacy between husband and wife that had transcended court formalities. "What do you wish, Queen Esther?" asked the king, his voice laden with genuine curiosity and concern. "What is your petition? Even if it be half the kingdom, it shall be given to you." Hui, the generosity of the offer revealed both the king's love and his perception that only something extraordinarily important could have led his wife to risk her life in this way. But Esther, with wisdom that surpassed her years and experience, did not immediately reveal the reason for her coming. Instead, she employed strategy that demonstrated both her political intelligence and her deep understanding of human nature. "If it pleases the king," she replied with melodious voice that carried tones of humility and dignity, "let the king come today with Haman to the banquet that I have prepared for him." The response surprised all present. After risking her life to obtain audience with the king, the queen asked only for a banquet? The apparent simplicity of the request contrasted dramatically with the drama of her approach, creating mystery that awakened even more royal curiosity. Ahasuerus, intrigued by his wife's unusual strategy and touched by her courage, immediately accepted the invitation. He ordered that Haman be summoned so they could attend to the queen's desire without delay. Haman, when he received the royal invitation, felt flattered to be included in intimate banquet with the king and queen, interpreting the honor as additional confirmation of his privileged position at court. The afternoon banquet was prepared with refined elegance that reflected both the queen's good taste and the importance she attributed to the occasion. The private chambers were decorated with rare flowers from the royal gardens. Tables were set with golden and silver vessels, and delicacies from throughout the empire were prepared by the palace's finest cooks. During the meal, Esther demonstrated hostess skills that charmed both the king and Haman. Her conversation was brilliant but unpretentious. Her manners were gracious without affectation, and her attention to the two men was balanced, so that both felt especially honored. Haman, in particular, was beside himself with satisfaction at participating in such exclusive intimacy with the royal family. Fee. When wine had circulated sufficiently to relax the formal atmosphere, the king returned to the question that had remained pending since morning. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What do you desire? Even if it be half the kingdom, it shall be done." Once again, to everyone's surprise, Esther did not reveal the true purpose of her coming. Instead, she employed a new layer of strategy that demonstrated her growing political sophistication. "My petition and desire is this: if I have found favor in the king's sight, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Esther's strategy was masterful in its apparent simplicity. By again postponing her revelation, she created suspense that would make her eventual revelation much more dramatic. She also guaranteed she would have a second opportunity in case the first did not produce desired results. Most importantly, she gave time for external events to work in her favor in ways she could not even imagine. Haman left the banquet in a state of euphoria that bordered on spiritual intoxication. He had been honored twice in one day by the queen herself, had participated in exclusive intimacy with the royal couple, and had been invited to repeat the experience the following day. In his grandiose mind, this confirmed that he had reached heights of prestige that few mortals had ever known. But when he left the palace and saw Mordecai at the gates, still dressed in mourning and still refusing to prostrate himself, all his euphoria transformed into renewed fury. The sight of the stubborn Jew poisoned even his greatest triumphs, reminding him that his authority was not yet absolutely recognized. Arriving home, Haman summoned his wife Zeresh and all his friends to share with them the extraordinary honors he had received that day. His words flowed like a river in flood as he described his riches, his many sons, all the ways the king had exalted him, and especially the queen's exclusive invitations to her private banquets. Yet all this, he concluded with bitterness that revealed how deeply Mordecai's resistance affected him, does not satisfy me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. It was then that his wife and friends suggested a solution that seemed perfect in its cruel simplicity. "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." Hoyt! The suggestion pleased Haman so much that he immediately ordered construction of the gigantic gallows. 50 cubits high, more than 20 meters, would ensure that Mordecai's execution would be visible from all over the city, serving as terrible example for anyone who thought of challenging his authority. While Haman planned Mordecai's death and anticipated with sadistic pleasure the queen's second banquet, he did not suspect that the events of that night would take a turn that would transform his plans for revenge into instrument of his own destruction. Destiny, like master strategist playing cosmic chess game, had placed all pieces in position for a reversal that no mortal could have foreseen. The approaching night would be a night of royal insomnia that would change the course of history. And Esther, in her chambers, prepared for the second act of her risky strategy, not knowing that forces far beyond her control were already conspiring to make her success not only possible, but inevitable. The night that preceded the second banquet was one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Persian Empire, though only a few of its participants understood at the time the magnitude of events unfolding in the shadows of power. While Haman slept deeply, dreaming of Mordecai's morning execution on the gigantic gallows he had ordered built, and while Esther remained awake in her chambers, reviewing every word she would say at the fateful banquet, King Ahasuerus found himself possessed by inexplicable insomnia that would change the destiny of millions of people. Royal insomnia was not an uncommon phenomenon. The cares of governing an empire that stretched across 3 continents frequently disturbed monarchs' sleep. But on that specific night, there was something different in Ahasuerus' restlessness, something that made him toss and turn in his royal bed without being able to find rest. It was as if invisible forces were manipulating the threads of destiny, ensuring he remained awake to witness events that needed his immediate attention. After hours of frustrated attempts to fall asleep, the king ordered that the books of Chronicles be brought, the official records where all significant events of the kingdom were noted. It was royal custom to use these tedious readings as remedy for insomnia, since monotonous accounts of administrative matters frequently induced sleep more quickly than any potion prepared by court physicians. The scribe who was summoned to read the Chronicles chose, apparently at random, a volume containing records from some years earlier. His monotonous voice echoed through the royal chamber as he recited lists of appointments, minor decrees, harvest reports, and other minutiae of imperial administration. The king listened with decreasing attention, hoping that bureaucratic torpor would finally overcome him and bring desired sleep. But then, emerging from the sea of administrative details like precious pearl found in oceanic depths, arose an account that made the king suddenly straighten in his bed. It was the record of a conspiracy discovered and thwarted, a plot to assassinate the king himself that had been revealed by a loyal official whose name was Mordecai. "Stop!" ordered Ahasuerus, his voice cutting the nocturnal air with sudden urgency. "Read that passage again, and read it slowly." The scribe, surprised by sudden royal attention, returned to the beginning of the account and read it with renewed care. The story unfolded like dramatic revelation. Bigthana and Teresh, two eunuchs who guarded the royal door, had conspired to kill the king. Mordecai had discovered the plot and reported it to appropriate authorities, thus saving the monarch's life. The conspirators were executed, but apparently no reward had been given to the man who saved the royal life. "What honor or dignity was conferred on Mordecai for this?" asked the king, his voice revealing growing interest in the matter. "Nothing was done for him," replied the scribe, after carefully consulting the records. The revelation struck Ahasuerus like lightning in a clear night. Here was unforgivable ingratitude on the part of the royal throne. A man had saved his life, probably risking his own safety by exposing dangerous conspirators, and had received neither public recognition nor material reward. It was a failure that stained the reputation of royal justice and needed to be corrected immediately, without consideration for the hour or circumstances. Ahasuerus rose from his bed and walked to his chamber window, contemplating the sleeping city that stretched below the palace. The first lights of dawn were beginning to paint the horizon with golden and rosy tones, announcing the new day that would bring with it so many unexpected revelations. In his mind, the king was already beginning to formulate plans to adequately honor the man who had saved his life. "Who is in the court?" he asked the guards posted in his chambers. By coincidence, that seemed orchestrated by the gods themselves, Haman had arrived at the palace exceptionally early that morning, eager to obtain royal audience and request permission to execute Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared during the night. His mind boiled with sadistic anticipation as he imagined the satisfaction of seeing his enemy die a humiliating death before all the city of Susa. "Haman is in the court," reported the guards. "Let him enter," ordered the king, seeing in his prime minister's arrival perfect opportunity to discuss how to adequately honor the man who had saved his life. Haman entered the royal chambers with characteristic confidence, interpreting the morning summons as favorable sign for his homicidal plans. He was preparing to present his request when the king spoke first, asking a question that caught the prime minister completely off guard. "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" To Haman, the question confirmed all his most grandiose fantasies about his own importance. Obviously, he thought, the king was planning to grant him even greater honors, perhaps elevating him to almost royal status. Who else could be the object of such royal favor but himself, the man who had achieved unprecedented position of power in the empire? With vanity that completely blinded his judgment, Haman responded by elaborating fantasy of honors that revealed both his excessive ambition and his complete lack of humility. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and let the royal crown be set on his head. And let the robes and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man whom the king delights to honor, and let him ride on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." The response revealed not only Haman's vainglory, but also his complete ignorance of the true nature of the situation. He had described ceremony of honors that bordered on coronation, imagining himself dressed in the very royal robes, riding the royal horse, being acclaimed by multitudes as if he were himself a king. Ahasuerus, oblivious to the grandiose thoughts that had motivated Haman's response, found the suggestion perfectly appropriate for honoring the man who had saved his life. "Excellent," said the king with evident satisfaction. "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have spoken." The king's words struck Haman like devastating avalanche that crushes everything in its path. In an instant, his fantasy of personal glory transformed into humiliating nightmare. Not only did he discover that he would not be the beneficiary of royal honors, but that he would be forced to confer those same honors on the man he most hated in the entire world. The man for whose execution he had come to request permission would instead be elevated to heights of public recognition that Haman himself had described in torturous detail. There was no possible escape from the royal order. Haman, with soul lacerated by cruel irony of fate, was forced to personally supervise every detail of the ceremony he had imagined for himself. His own hands dressed Mordecai in royal robes. His own words proclaimed through the streets of Susa, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." The procession through the capital streets was crushing triumph for Mordecai and complete humiliation for Haman. The crowds that witnessed the spectacle immediately understood they were witnessing dramatic reversal in Palatine power. The Jew who had been seen in mourning just days before was now exalted with almost royal honors, while the most powerful man in the empire was reduced to role of public servant, proclaiming his enemy's greatness. When the ceremony ended, Haman retired to his house in state of profound shock. His wife Zeresh and his counselors, who just the night before had celebrated his triumphs and encouraged his revenge plans, now looked at him with growing horror. The gigantic gallows that had been built for Mordecai still stood in his garden like monument to destiny's irony. "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent," said Zeresh, with voice laden with ominous foreboding, "you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Those prophetic words were still echoing in the air when royal eunuchs arrived to escort Haman to Queen Esther's second banquet. The man who had arrived at the palace that morning planning his enemy's execution now followed toward event that would seal his own destiny. Not suspecting that the queen who had honored him with exclusive invitations was about to reveal herself as member of the same people he had planned to exterminate. The hall where Esther had prepared the second banquet surpassed in elegance and refinement even the first. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to create atmosphere of royal intimacy that would make her revelation even more dramatic. Rare flowers from imperial gardens perfumed the air, golden vessels reflected light from hundreds of lamps, and delicacies from throughout the known empire were arranged with art that rivaled the finest creations of masters. Esther received her guests dressed in splendor that surpassed even her appearance at the first banquet. Her garments were of imperial purple, embroidered with gold threads that formed intricate patterns inspired by Persian art. But her jewels were chosen with hidden meaning, pieces she had received from Mordecai years before, when she was still only Hadassah, the humble orphan from a forgotten quarter of Susa. During the first hours of the banquet, conversation flowed with ease that masked growing tension in the queen's heart. Haman, still disturbed by the morning's events but trying to recover his usual composure, struggled to appear relaxed and confident. The king, invigorated by satisfaction of having finally honored the man who saved his life, was in exceptionally good humor. But when wine had circulated sufficiently and atmosphere had reached perfect point of relaxed intimacy, King Ahasuerus again asked the question he had posed 2 consecutive days. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half the kingdom. It shall be done." This time, Esther postponed her answer no longer. With voice that combined royal dignity with deeply human emotion, she finally revealed the true purpose that had led her to risk her life. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." The devastating simplicity of the words created absolute silence in the hall. King and Haman looked at the queen with expressions of growing surprise, trying to process the complete meaning of what they had just heard. Was the most powerful woman in the empire pleading for her own life and the life of her people? Esther continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally released words she had kept in her heart for so long. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my peace, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's damage." The revelation exploded in the hall like thunder that splits the sky in violent storm. Haman felt blood drain from his face as he understood, with growing horror, that the queen whose favors he had interpreted as signs of his own greatness was member of the same people he had planned to exterminate. The irony was so cruel, so completely devastating, that for moments he could not even breathe properly. King Ahasuerus rose from his place with violence that made golden plates rattle on the table, his face contorted with fury that was rarely seen even by those who knew him most intimately. "Who is he? And where is he? Who dared presume in his heart to do this?" he roared, his voice echoing through the hall's walls like thunder of apocalyptic storm. Esther, gathering all her courage for the final moment of her revelation, also rose and pointed to Haman with gesture that carried all the weight of divine justice. "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Haman, struck by the accusation as if he had been hit by lightning, remained paralyzed in his place, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of catastrophe that had befallen him. In a matter of seconds, he had gone from all-powerful prime minister to condemned criminal, from man planning genocide to victim of his own diabolical machination. The king, his fury growing like tidal wave approaching shore, rose from the table and went out to the palace garden, needing fresh air to process the massive betrayal he had just discovered. He had trusted Haman completely, had given him almost royal authority, had sealed with his own ring the decree that would condemn millions of innocent people to death. And all this had been result of calculated manipulation by man driven by personal hatred and sick ambition. Haman, perceiving that his life now depended on clemency he had no reason to expect, threw himself at Esther's feet in abject desperation. The man who hours before had been forced to proclaim Mordecai's honors through Susa's streets now pleaded for mercy from the woman whose people he had tried to exterminate. His pleas were broken by sobs of terror. His incoherent words revealed man completely broken by weight of his own discovered evil. When the king returned from the garden and saw Haman prostrate on the couch where Esther was reclining, he interpreted the scene as final attempt to violate royal dignity. "Will he also assault the queen before me in the house?" he cried, his voice laden with indignation that knew no bounds. As soon as those words left the royal mouth, servants covered Haman's face, symbolic gesture indicating he was condemned to death. There would be no trial, no possibility of appeal, no mercy for one who had deceived the king and tried to destroy the queen and her entire people. It was then that Harbona, one of the eunuchs serving the king, made observation that would definitively seal Haman's fate. "Look, the very gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." The final irony was so perfect, it seemed to have been orchestrated by divine playwrights. The very gallows Haman had built to execute the man who saved the king's life would now be used for his own execution. The instrument of planned revenge would become vehicle of poetic justice. "Hang him on it!" ordered the king without hesitation. Thus Haman was taken to meet his end on the same gigantic gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, dying the same humiliating death he had planned for his enemy. His execution was witnessed by crowds who just hours before had seen Mordecai honored with almost royal ceremonies. The entire city understood they had witnessed dramatic reversal in the fortune of two men whose destinies were intertwined in ways no mortal could have foreseen. With Haman's death, the first phase of Esther's salvation for her people had been completed. The architect of planned genocide had been removed, but the mortal decree he had promulgated still remained in force, sealed with the royal ring and carrying force of law throughout the empire. The battle for survival of the Jewish people was far from over, but the first and most crucial victory had been won through courage of a queen who had risked everything to save those she loved. Haman's death, hanging from the gigantic gallows he himself had erected as monument to his arrogance, echoed throughout the Persian Empire like thunder, announcing transforming storm. But even with execution of the architect of planned genocide, the mortal threat hanging over the Jewish people remained like swords suspended by invisible thread. The decree sealed with the royal ring continued in force, spread throughout all 127 provinces of the empire, establishing that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, all Jews would be exterminated. The laws of the Persian Empire possessed characteristics that made them simultaneously stable and inflexible. Once promulgated and sealed with the royal ring, they became irreversible as the course of rivers or succession of seasons. Not even the king himself possessed authority to revoke decree that had been officially proclaimed, for this would undermine entire legal system upon which imperial authority rested. It was as if the very words, once written and sealed, acquired life of their own and power independent of their creator's will. On the same day Haman met his ignominious end, King Ahasuerus made decision that demonstrated both his gratitude toward Esther and his recognition of magnitude of injustice that had been perpetrated in his name. All properties of the executed prime minister, his vast lands, his ornate palaces, his treasures accumulated over years of royal favor, were transferred to Queen Esther as inadequate but symbolic compensation for sufferings his thoughtless decision had caused. Even more significant was the gesture with which the king honored Mordecai, the man who had saved his life and now revealed himself as cousin and adoptive father of the queen. Ahasuerus removed from his own finger the royal signet ring, the same he had so carelessly handed to Haman, and placed it in Mordecai's hand. It was transfer of authority that instantly elevated the former scribe from the gates to position of power that rivaled that of the king himself. The royal ring was not merely ornamental symbol of authority, it was practical instrument of absolute power. Whoever possessed it could issue decrees that would become law throughout the empire, mobilize armies, decree taxes, appoint governors, and exercise all prerogatives of imperial authority except using the title of king. Mordecai, in matter of hours, had gone from man marked for death to second most powerful man in the known world. Esther, demonstrating political wisdom that perfectly complemented her personal courage, immediately appointed Mordecai administrator of all confiscated properties of Haman. It was decision that not only guaranteed these resources would be used to benefit the Jewish people, but also publicly established Mordecai's position as authority figure recognized by the queen herself. But even with these dramatic victories, the fundamental question remained: how to save millions of Jewish lives when the decree ordering their destruction could not be revoked. It was legal and political puzzle that demanded creative solution, something that transcended apparently insurmountable limitations of Persian laws. It was then that Esther, again demonstrating combination of courage and cunning that had characterized all her actions since discovering the danger faced by her people, presented herself once more before the king. This time, however, she did not need to risk her life by coming unsummoned. Her position had been consolidated by dramatic events of previous days, and her influence over the royal heart was at its peak. Prostrating herself at the king's feet with tears that sprang from genuine depths of emotion, Esther made plea that combined personal humility with desperate urgency. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and if the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. Her following words revealed not only depth of her love for her people, but also natural eloquence that had made her so persuasive. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? The appeal touched the king's heart, not only as monarch conscious of his responsibility, but as man who deeply loved the woman making the plea. Ahasuerus understood that, although he could not revoke the original decree, he could authorize new decree that would give Jews legal means to defend themselves. The solution that emerged was masterpiece of legal creativity that transformed apparently insurmountable limitation into opportunity for amplified justice. If Persian law did not permit revocation of decrees, it did permit issuance of new decrees that could radically modify circumstances under which previous decrees would be implemented. Mordecai, now invested with authority of the royal ring, was summoned to dictate new edict that would be sent to all provinces of the empire. Royal scribes worked with feverish urgency, copying the decree in all languages and scripts used in various regions of the empire: Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, Greek, Egyptian, and dozens of other local languages that would ensure no corner of the empire remained ignorant of the new law. The new decree was revolutionary in its scope and generosity. It not only granted Jews right to defend themselves on the day marked for their destruction, but authorized them to gather, arm themselves, and destroy any armed force that attacked them. Moreover, it allowed them to confiscate goods of their attackers, creating powerful economic incentive for them to defend themselves vigorously. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the new decree was its temporal extension. While the original decree limited persecution to single day, the new edict guaranteed Jews' right of self-defense whenever they felt threatened. It was fundamental transformation that converted passive victims into active agents of their own protection. Royal couriers who carried the new decree to distant provinces traveled with urgency that surpassed even the speed with which original edict had been disseminated. They mounted fresh horses at each courier station, rode day and night through scorching deserts and frozen mountains, crossed rushing rivers and endless plains, all driven by understanding they carried message that could save millions of lives. When news of the new decree began reaching Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, transformation was as dramatic as it was instantaneous. Deep mourning that had characterized these communities since learning of their condemnation gave way to explosion of joy that echoed through cities and villages like celestial music, finally heard after long silence. In Susa, the very capital, change was particularly visible. Mordecai, who days before had walked the streets dressed in sackcloth and covered with ashes, now appeared in public wearing royal garments of blue and white, with great crown of gold upon his head and mantle of fine linen and purple that proclaimed his new position to all who saw him. His transformation from despised mourner to imperial prince perfectly symbolized reversal of fortunes that had benefited his entire people. The entire city of Susa rejoiced at Mordecai's elevation because they understood they had witnessed extraordinary example of justice triumphing over oppression. Crowds gathered in streets to see pass the man who had been honored by the king, applauding and shouting blessings that echoed among marble buildings like chorus of popular approval. But transformation was not limited to the capital. In every province, in every city, in every village where Jews resided, there was light and gladness, feasting and joy. Communities that had prepared to die now prepared to live, and live abundantly. Terror that had dominated their hearts gave way to renewed hope that shone like sun emerging from stormy clouds. One of most surprising consequences of events was phenomenon no one had anticipated. Throughout the empire, many people of other nationalities declared themselves Jews. Some were motivated by genuine admiration for people who had demonstrated such resilience before adversity. Others were influenced by desire to associate with group that had obtained such dramatic favor from royal family. Still others were moved by fear that remaining hostile to Jews might attract undesirable consequences. This mass conversion movement created demographic transformation that permanently altered ethnic and religious composition of many regions of the empire. Entire communities adopted Jewish customs, learned Hebrew language, and embraced faith in God of Israel. It was as if threat of extinction had resulted not in diminishment of Jewish people, but in their multiplication throughout the known world. When finally the 13th day of month of Adar arrived, the day that had been destined for total Holocaust, reality was exactly opposite to what Haman had planned. Instead of Jews being killed by their enemies, it was enemies of Jews who perished in massive numbers. Authorization for self-defense, combined with terror that Haman's story had inspired among potential persecutors, resulted in victory so complete it became legend. Battles that occurred on that day were not prolonged or bloody conflicts. In most cases, those who had planned to attack Jewish communities found themselves confronted by well-organized, well-armed adversaries supported by imperial authority. Many potential attackers simply fled upon perceiving tide had completely turned. Others surrendered without fighting. Only most fanatically hostile persisted in their original plans, and these were defeated quickly and decisively. In Susa, Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons, ensuring persecutors' lineage was completely extinguished. It was poetic justice that satisfied both practical need to eliminate future foci of revenge and symbolic desire to demonstrate that Haman's actions had resulted in destruction of his own family. When Esther learned that Haman's 10 sons had been killed, she requested additional permission from the king that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of public policy. She asked that bodies of Haman's sons be publicly hanged as warning to anyone who might consider following their father's example. It was measure that would ensure lesson of recent events was clearly communicated to future generations. The following day, 14th of Adar, Jews in provinces rested and made that day a day of feasting and gladness. In Susa, where fighting had continued for 2 days due to greater number of enemies in capital, rest came only on 15th day. This difference in dates established tradition that would endure through centuries. Jews in walled cities would celebrate on 15th of Adar, while those in open cities would celebrate on 14th. It was then that Mordecai, exercising his new authority as second man of the kingdom, took initiative that would ensure extraordinary events of those days would never be forgotten. He sent letters to all Jews in all 127 provinces of Ahasuerus' kingdom, officially establishing annual celebration that would be known as Feast of Purim, in reference to lots that Haman had cast to determine day of planned destruction. Feast instituted by Mordecai was not somber celebration or mourning ceremony for dangers overcome, but explosion of joy that reflected magnitude of salvation that had been achieved. It should include elaborate banquets, exchange of gifts between friends and family, generous donations to poor, and public reading of complete story of events that had led to salvation. It was celebration that combined spiritual gratitude with material joy, solemn recognition with exuberant festival. Esther, using her authority as queen, confirmed and amplified Mordecai's decree establishing Feast of Purim. Her participation guaranteed celebration would have both civil and religious sanction, ensuring its continuity through future generations. Words she wrote establishing the feast became part of sacred literature of Jewish people, preserved as permanent testimony of her courage and wisdom. Mordecai's transformation from humble scribe to second man of most powerful kingdom on earth was consolidated through administrative reforms that benefited not only Jews, but entire empire. His practical experience in bureaucratic functions, combined with moral integrity that had been tested in most extreme circumstances, made him exceptional administrator who introduced efficiencies and improvements that increased general prosperity. Under Mordecai's leadership, empire's justice system was reformed to guarantee better protection for minorities and vulnerable communities. New procedures were established to prevent decrees based on prejudice or personal motivations from being promulgated without adequate scrutiny. It was legislative legacy that would protect future generations from repeating near catastrophes that had been narrowly avoided. Esther, for her part, used her position as queen to establish precedents that significantly expanded women's influence in imperial politics. She demonstrated that queens could be not just decorative consorts, but active participants in governance, who contributed perspectives and solutions that complemented male rulers' vision. Her example inspired other noble women to become more actively involved in public policy matters. Fame of Esther and Mordecai's story spread far beyond borders of Persian Empire. Merchants and travelers carried accounts of extraordinary events to distant lands, where stories were retold and embellished, until they became legends that inspired peoples in completely different cultures. Narrative of orphan who became queen and saved her people from extinction resonated with universal themes of justice, courage, and triumph of good over evil. In years that followed, kingdom prospered under Mordecai's wise administration and Esther's benevolent influence. Persian Empire reached heights of political stability and economic prosperity that rivaled its greatest previous eras. Ethnic and religious diversity that had been threatened by Haman's plans was not only preserved, but celebrated as source of imperial strength. Mordecai established policies that encouraged cultural exchange between different communities of the empire, promoting mutual understanding and cooperation that dramatically reduced ethnic tensions that had made Haman's rise to power possible. Multicultural festivals were instituted in various cities, where people of different backgrounds could share their traditions and learn from one another. Feast of Purim, established to commemorate Jews' salvation, gradually evolved to become broader celebration of religious freedom and protection of minorities. Even non-Jews began participating in festivities, seeing in them affirmation of principles of tolerance and justice that benefited entire society. Esther and Mordecai, conscious that their generation would eventually pass, dedicated considerable energy to carefully documenting events they had lived through and lessons they had learned. They established schools and libraries where these stories would be preserved and taught, ensuring future generations would understand both dangers of intolerance and power of individual courage to change course of history. Thus, the queen who had kept her secret for so long became transparent symbol of hope for all who face persecution. The orphan, who had been chosen for her beauty, revealed herself to possess courage and wisdom that saved an entire nation. And the young woman who had risked everything for such a time as this left legacy that continues to inspire those who believe justice and mercy can triumph over hatred and oppression, no matter how powerful forces of evil may seem.